Hi everybody. In this video, what we're going to be doing is looking at how we can start texturing this model with some of our smart textures and see what some of our final result might look like without really having to do a lot of work. So the main thing that we want to look at here is the fact that we've got this exploded model. Now this is actually pretty tricky to texture. You've got to kind of zoom in to a lot of spots and zoom out, and it's just a little awkward to deal with. So the thing that you may want to actually work with is a different model. The fact of the matter is your baking model may not look the same as the kind of model you want to texture with. So all I did was inside of 3D Studio Max is take some of the various models that we've done in our previous video and just export them as a single OBJ. Now, how can we view them in here? Well, actually very easily. So just go to your Edit, Project Configuration, Project Mesh. You just select that, and in this case, I've got this object here. They all have one material applied to them. And you just basically open that up and say, basically, okay. It'll recompute everything. And what'll happen here is because it's going to be using this same kind of texture space, the same unwrap, we basically just have all those various pieces that we were working with previously. This is really useful because it's going to tell us what looks good as a whole and how everything is going to look and feel with their various different kind of constructions. This is much easier to look at in general than an exploded model, and you actually don't lose any information. I do want to leave one caveat though. If you had started texturing with an empty layer, for example, and you start doing something like this, actually let's just bring that up to the top here. If you started texturing on your model, I will point out right away that if you do say project configuration and bring something in, those brushstrokes will probably be lost. These are actually painted in physical space. So if, for example, this mesh itself moved when I re-imported, those brushstrokes would be offset, which doesn't work very well and causes a number of problems. So just be aware of that. Any of the procedural texturing, which exists like this, which is all just based off of existing texture maps, those work perfectly fine and they translate perfectly to different meshes because it's all just based off of unwraps. But in this case, you just have to be aware of the fact that if you have done any brush work, that will get lost or will get somewhat broken. So we've basically got all of this set up the way that we want, but it doesn't look very believable, does it? So the one thing we want to do is maybe start adding in some different kinds of materials. You'll see down here we've got materials, smart masks. There's a bunch of stuff to work with down here, and it seems relatively interesting. So what we want to do is just drag some of this over so we see this a little bit better. And you're basically seeing information that's in our shelf. Substance Painter comes with a number of provided materials that you can use. There's also a website called Substance Share. Substance Share is a website that contains a whole bunch of community-provided substances and textures and materials and things like that, and filters and a number of really cool things that you can use for free on any of the work that you're doing inside of Substance Painter. They go in really easily. You can basically find whatever you're looking for, some materials and various things, and basically just download them and put them inside of Substance and use them on whatever it is that you'd like. We're not going to be using any of those in this case, but if you feel like starting off with that kind of stuff, it is very useful for kind of getting started. But back inside Substance, we're basically just going to look at this kind of result that we have here and start trying to add some stuff to it. So for example, if I wanted a physically appropriate kind of copper, I could just drag this copper material up in here and just drop it down. Now what that's going to do is automatically just set up a copper pure material for myself that is going to sit on this surface. Now you'll see it's a little bit brighter and not quite stylized and interesting the way that I would like. I could try a brass. Let's just drop that in on top and you'll start seeing how those materials look in here. And that's pretty darn good. Now I am going to delete both of these though. I don't really want them. I want something a little bit more interesting. So let's go to one of our smart materials. And we could start going through here and start grabbing different pieces. So let's say bronze armor. So that's basically just going to get dropped in, and it's going to compile all of the different results in here. So what we're seeing now is a variety of different materials being added into our texture. So this is what's called a bronze armor, and it's called a smart material. And so we're actually already by default getting some pretty interesting results. Stuff that honestly, in some cases, you could totally stick with. Certain ones work better than others, and it totally depends on which ones you like as you kind of go through this list. So that's, not too bad. But what is existing here? Well, we basically got a group. So again, Control G creates those. We've already got one of our own, and we've got a group inside of our group. So let's just open that up by clicking this little button and scroll on down. So we'll see that we have a sharpened filter being applied to this. I'll explain how that works in a moment. So let's just turn that off because you can start to see the results that we're getting from it. Let's just turn that on and off, and it works like a sharpened filter inside of Photoshop. But let's just kind of turn each of these off and see what we're starting with. So we've got this base metal with a couple of other elements in it. So what are these? Well, if I right click and I say something like add fill, I can basically add a fill layer into my already existing fill layer. So this element becomes a little bit confusing to deal with. It's a little bit more obvious in other kinds of elements, but this is where we'll start. So first off, we could add in a fill layer inside of this, which means maybe we want to just adjust the color of the underlying surface. So maybe we want to make this sort of, let's just remove all these for the moment. We can see what our base layer is, which is this brown. But maybe we want to offset that a little bit with some red, but maybe at a low opacity level. So there's just a little bit of red added into this as a separate element. Maybe we wanted to set that to an overlay as well, just to kind of add a little bit more red to that. That is how we could do something like that. We could also add textures into this fill layer, and some of this works to basically just kind of make sure your textures and your layers don't get out of control. You could also start to add in various other kinds of elements in here, but that's how a fill layer works in this case. But we could add lots of different types of things, such as a paint layer, where now we can actually start to just paint on top of this as well. So we've got a fill layer that also has some paint in it, and that's perfectly good to work with as well. Now in this case, what they've added in is a substance called Finish Rough, which we can see in here. So what this is basically called is a filter. So let's just add one in here, add filter. And filters can do a number of interesting things. There's a variety of them in here. They can be gradient maps. They could be a hue and saturation shift so that you could start to change the saturation there. Let's just turn off all these other elements. So we're only affecting color in this case. And that would just mean that we're kind of shifting the hue there or increasing the saturation, lowering the luminosity, if you wanted to just offset the existing kind of base color you're working with. So we can just turn that off. And Finish Rough, in this case, is the filter that's being used, which is creating this little bit of a rough kind of material contrast in here. There's a little bit of color contained in this. These are interesting filters. They're very different from what exists inside of Photoshop for filters, so they're a little bit harder to get a grasp of, but basically it's just adding a little bit of texture to this. It's also adding a fill with a little bit of actual grunge texture to it. Now what this is a procedural texture, which we'll dig into a little bit more in one of our next little series. And you'll see here we've got a number of procedurals inside of our texture palette over here on our shelf. And those are basically just procedural textures. They can be randomized and changed, and there's a ton of them. And so what that's doing in here is adding into the rough channel. If we press C, you'll see our various different kinds of textures that are existing in the background. So for example, I can just press C again and we'll see the height information, C, and we see roughness, all visualized in just straight unlit kind of settings. C again will show us metallic, normal, and we can press B if we wanted to see how that's going to look on our actual additional maps, the baked maps. So B again for world space, B for ID, B for ambient occlusion, B for curvature, B for position, and again B for thickness, and then back to normal. If we press M, we will pop back into our regular view. So again, let's just press C, go over to roughness. This is useful because we can see how this roughness here is affecting this. We could change our UV scale if we wanted that to repeat itself a lot more or a lot less. We could also change the balance of this, so sort of the intensity, either dark or light. We could increase the contrast and a number of things. All of these allow you to change the effect of this texture quite a bit. And these are basically all just the various layers that are going in to making this effect. We could add this dirt layer back in, which is basically just adding a little bit of grunge into this. So it's basically got a regular fill layer, and then it has a mask, which is using a mask editor generator. So again, to get any of that, you just right-click on your mask, you scroll on down to generator, And you get the ability to add in any kind of effect that you want. So say, for example, we'll just drop in the mask builder, which creates a pretty notable effect for us. And it's pretty interesting to look at there. And so basically these various generators will create different kinds of effects based off of the existing maps that exist underneath. And they have a whole bunch of parameters, and we can dig into them in a little bit more detail. Their image inputs right now are relatively simple. It's curvature, ambient occlusion, and world space. And then you can affect them in a variety of ways on top. But basically all of these are just going to give us various kinds of effects that we can work with and start to make a little bit more interesting. We could increase their contrast a little bit here so it's a more noticeable kind of effect. Surface details can create just little scratches and bumps and things like that. Edge damages just to kind of wear the whole thing down and start looking like a more believable kind of material. But that is basically what a smart material is. Then a sharpen on top of it just to kind of intensify those details that exist underneath. And that is bronze armor. We could drop in various other types of pieces, such as maybe copper armor, or copper worn in this case. And that'll give us also a pretty interesting effect in here, a little bit more subtle than the previous. But we can always go into significantly more interesting and complex kinds of pieces, such as maybe machinery. So it'll take a minute to kind of generate all that information, but then you get something like this. And all of it is built based off of your curvature maps, your ambient occlusion, and all of those elements. So it looks pretty natural pretty much right away. And all of those are really, really interesting effects you can get out of Substance Designer and some of these smart materials right away. So for example, we could even just pop over here and go back into like one of these concretes, drop that into our rock section, and we've got a rock texture basically appearing right here, right away, with basically no work. And then we've got both of our parts existing. And if we wanted to affect any of these on their own, just to kind of get some basic effects, like let's say, let's enhance some of that roughness here so it's not so dark right away, then we've got something pretty interesting to work with right from the get-go. And that's basically some of the general interface information that we can think about when we're jumping into Substance to start getting some basic results very, very quickly without too much work. But in our next series, what we're going to be looking at is how we can do a lot of this work ourselves without necessarily needing to rely on smart materials or anything like that. We can start to build up the work we want, looking the exact way we want.